and a warm welcome to this week's edition of Africa 360. I'm your host, Kwangu Liwewe. Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta recently made an historic decision. He became Africa's first head of state to temporarily step down to face charges at the International Criminal Court. Some say it's nothing more than a publicity stunt, while others suggest that African leaders would do well to follow his example. This week on Africa 360, we explore power on the African continent and those leaders who just can't let go. Africa 360 senior producer Lindy Mtongana filed this report.
In an unprecedented move, Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta becomes Africa's first head of state to voluntarily step down to attend a hearing at The Hague. Charged with crimes related to ethnic massacres, Kenyatta has opted to face the International Criminal Court in his personal capacity, rather than compromise the sovereignty of Kenya.
I now take the extraordinary and unprecedented step of invoking Article 147(3) of the Constitution, and I will shortly issue the legal notice necessary to appoint Honorable William Ruto, the Deputy President, as acting President while I attend the status conference at The Hague in the Netherlands.
While the decision has little bearing on ICC proceedings, it has not gone unnoticed on the continent as an example to African leaders who cling to power.
Politically, I think he's sending a good message to say that I was criminally, I'm being investigated criminally in my individual personal capacity, but not as head of state. Therefore, I'm going to answer to the criminal charges as a person, the way I've been charged and indicted.
In spite of sickness, old age, and in some cases incompetence, Africa has seen leaders hold on to power until the bitter end. Since 2008, 10 African leaders have died in office, including Malawi's Bingu wa Mutharika, Ethiopia's Meles Zenawi, and Omar Bongo, who ruled Gabon for 41 years until his death in 2009.
The impact it immediately creates if you overstay is actually to suffocate this desire for greater freedom among the people. You know, the people have not been created spaces to freely and as free as possible, you know, advocate for change and you know, choose their own leadership in a free and fair elections, because they have taken it. Some people have taken it for granted that because he has stayed for too long, we have no right to choose. This is the person who has been anointed by God.
Africa's current longest-serving leaders are Teodoro Ngwema Obiang, who has ruled oil-rich Equatorial Guinea for 35 years, a figure matched only by José Eduardo dos Santos of Angola. At 90, Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe is the world's oldest-serving head of state. He marked 34 years at the helm this year. It appears these leaders aren't making any retirement plans just yet.
I will never surrender. Zimbabwe is mine.
Some leaders are simply here to stay. Through sickness and health, till death do us part.
Well, thank you, Lindy, for that in-depth report. President Uhuru Kenyatta's decision has earned him lots of praise in his home country, with many proclaiming his innocence and declaring their undying support for their leader. Now let's explore the president's decision a little further. David Mwaniki, the chief executive at the Global Crisis Solution, joins me now from our Pretoria studios. Hi, David. Uhuru Kenyatta's decision to go to The Hague in his personal capacity so as not to, and I quote, compromise the sovereignty of the Kenyan people. Now, you do recall, of course, he was elected president despite charges from the ICC, and some believed he turned the prosecution to his advantage, alleging foreign intervention in Kenya's domestic affairs. So why is he actually going to The Hague if he was talking about foreign intervention?
Well, Kwangu, I think we need to go back to the genesis of this ICC case. President Uhuru Kenyatta was indicted before he was elected into office as the president of Kenya. And at the point when the indictment came through, the one commitment he made was that he would see through the legal process to the end. So in a sense, this is him meeting his commitment. And of course, we must recall that he was not indicted as the president of Kenya. And therefore, it is befitting and actually quite a strategic move on his part to go there as an individual and not as the president of Kenya.
But David, last year there was a special AU summit where we know mass withdrawal from the ICC was discussed, and that fell through. And then the AU asked the Security Council to defer his hearing. That failed as well. Now, when push comes to shove, did he have a choice but to go?
No, indeed, Kwangu, he's going as a citizen of Kenya and not as a president. In fact, reaffirms that common African position. Because one of the things that emerged out of that was that a sitting president should not attend ICC hearings. Now, of course, Uhuru is following through with that common position from the African Union and therefore ensuring that that agenda carries through.
As a politician, Kenyatta is imposing and a force to reckon with. His father is the founding father of the nation. His family has got enormous wealth. He's savvy and articulate. And of course, he's the president of one of Africa's most advanced economy. Is he using his position to open an offensive against the court?
That's a difficult call to make. One would imagine that being indicted by the ICC, you would put up the best defense possible. The question then one would ask is, has he used state machinery at his disposal to influence this case in any way? What we are hearing from the Attorney General in Kenya is that Kenya has complied with all the requests of the prosecutor in terms of the evidence that has been requested. Uhuru Kenyatta, the president himself, has said that he has granted authority to all organs of state to provide assistance and evidence to the court. So one could say that indeed he could, but there is no evidence that he's doing so.
Now, when we look at other African leaders on the continent, I mean, some are pretty old, even in the age of about 90 years of age. We've got other presidents who are allegedly ailing, but still clinging on to power. Isn't this sending a bad message to the rest of the world?
Well, there's a positive story coming out of Africa, Kwangu, and this is the story that I would like to share with you. Africa Rising is also synonymous to its leadership and its processes around democracy and the kind of leadership that we have at the apex of our countries. The general trend is that leadership has improved in Africa. Indeed, you've raised some very interesting questions. We have two leaders who are over 90 who are probably still going to be running for office. We have some who are extremely unwell, who don't even admit that they are, and who probably die in office. But these negative stories do not define the leadership landscape of our continent.
What does define the leadership landscape then, David?
I think that what defines it is our ability to mobilize around Africa's growth agenda. I mean, what I see when we look at interstate developmental projects that are driven by regional integration, these are critical indicators of good leadership.
Well, David, thank you very much for your insight on this issue. Do stay with us, because after the break, we take this discussion further with our panel of guests. Don't go away.
There's economic and political elites that emerge. They come together, the business and the political elements in society, and they just hold the whole country to hostage. They pervert the law, they use the law.
Welcome back to Africa 360. This week, we're focusing on African leadership and whether there are any lessons to be learned from President Uhuru Kenyatta's recent decision to temporarily step down as leader of Kenya. I'm now joined by Tiseke Kasambala from Human Rights Watch and Sipho Malunga from the Open Society Initiative of Southern Africa. Also joining us is Professor Ajulu from Dye Associates. My guests, thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Malunga, I'll start with you. It's unprecedented for any leader, African leader, to temporarily or permanently step down for the good of the people. Are you applauding Uhuru for this move?
Thank you very much, Kwangu. I think President Uhuru Kenyatta did what he was supposed to do. He was indicted by the court way before he became president. He has appeared before the International Criminal Court before, and he became president afterwards. So going to the court is simply what he really should have done.
And stepping aside temporarily?
I think we shouldn't make too much of that. I think he has stepped aside, but the key word here is temporarily. He is going to come when he returns from the hearing. He is going to come back and continue as president. And I think that is the fact that he stepped down or not is neither here nor there in terms of the charges against him, because there is no immunity in any case for a sitting head of state under the ICC, nor is there any immunity under Kenya's own constitution.
So he had no choice but to go, Professor?
No, he had, yeah, thank you very much. He had no choice. But I don't understand why people are making so much about stepping aside.
Because it's the first.
No, it might be the first, but it's the normal way of doing things. The president is out of the country. There must be an acting. Okay, so he can't be president out of the country. He's still, wherever he is, he's still President Uhuru Kenyatta. He hasn't stopped being President Uhuru Kenyatta. He's just out of the office. When he's out of the office, somebody must step in, even if it's only for 2 days. That happens all over the world. So I don't know why the press is making so much about it. But as to step down so that he can go and attend ICC, he had no alternative. This is somebody who has tried his level best over the last 2 years to avoid going to ICC. This is somebody who has lobbied almost all African countries to avoid going to ICC. They've gone and lobbied even the UN to avoid going to ICC. So he got to a stage where there was no alternative. He had to go.
Well, an interesting observation, if you just look at the plasma screen there, you see Uhuru Kenyatta there, just about to board a KQ flight to the Netherlands, and he's gone there as an ordinary citizen. You can see he's got not much security detail, but of course the cameras are focusing on him. Would you say this is a publicity stunt?
This is a publicity stunt, and not a very good one, because everybody knows that Uhuru's got a jet, they got security. And when you're going away, you don't announce, now today I've given my security to my deputy and I've given my jet to my deputy. That's a publicity stunt. We all know about that.
Sipho, is he trying to be a righteous leader?
But there's something else, though, that's happened since, he became president. We've heard from the prosecutor at the ICC that the case is looking increasingly bad against Uhuru. So the prosecuting witnesses are not cooperating. The government apparently has not cooperated in many respects. So it could very well be a calculation that is based on an understanding by the defense of the weakness now of the prosecution case, and now the obviously readiness to face whatever charges, because the charges may not be sustainable ultimately. So we don't know that, right? But the reality of it is that there seems to have been a significant shift in the strength of the prosecution case in the period since the president has been in office.
And do you think that's why he's decided to go?
Perhaps.
It's been a problematic case for a number of reasons. And I think it's not just about witnesses not cooperating. It's the fact that witnesses have possibly been intimidated, threatened, or bribed. The fact that the prosecutor has lost several witnesses that were key to our case. The fact that the Kenyan government has not produced all the documents that the prosecution has requested, including financial records from Uhuru Kenyatta. And I think that's the problem here. But also the case that I think the prosecution's own investigations were weak. And that was a big one. And the initial investigations were weak. And I think Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda herself has acknowledged that and has said that there is a need to strengthen the ICC's and the way it investigates cases. And all this has come together to produce what we've seen as a very weak case. And I think, of course, like Sipho says, Uhuru Kenyatta is very aware of that. And he's going around with this PR exercise, which actually detracts from the fact that he's someone who's been charged for serious crimes and crimes against humanity.
Okay, let's go back to talking about leadership on the continent. The Mo Ibrahim's prize to leaders who voluntarily leave office. We saw this go to Nelson Mandela of South Africa, Festus Mogae of Botswana, and Joachim Chissano of Mozambique. But since 2009, the prize hasn't been reclaimed. Is this damning for Africa?
I have a lot of respect for Mo Ibrahim. I think that he has distinguished himself astutely as an amazing business person. He cares a lot about governance, and the foundation is set up has focused a lot on governance. I do have a problem, though, with rewarding leaders for what they really are supposed to do. There is absolutely no reason. I believe it's good to acknowledge and to recognize excellent leaders, But I don't believe that leaders should be rewarded for what they're supposed to do. They stand there and they ask for a mandate from the people. They command a significant amount of power, a significant amount of resources, and they must govern in the public interest. And we should just thank them for that, and that's it.
But probably this is the state of affairs in Africa, within the African leadership, that somebody has to hang some 10 million around your nose.
How does that help, Prof? These people control hundreds of millions of dollars.
But it's an indictment of the leadership.
It's an indictment of leadership. So somebody has to hang some money to entice you to leave office when your time for leaving office comes in. So basically, it speaks to what we have in Africa. The question that we should be asking, why? What is it about Africa that brings this kind of thing? Is it because Africans behave like this? Or can we explain it? Can we go beyond individuals to explain what is the problem with the post-colony in Africa?
Just following up on his position about African leadership, I mean, we do see we've got aging presidents, we've got ailing presidents, but yet they're still clinging on to power. And some will argue that, well, actually, at the end of the day, it is the will of the people. They voted them in. They're not complaining about the ailing presidents. They're still in their positions. What's your take on that?
I think people are complaining about the ailing presidents. When you look at the situation in Angola, for example, where President Dos Santos has been in power for many years now, I think it's over 20 years in power, the Angolan people are highly repressed. He ensures that he has control over all state institutions, over the media, over the press. And whenever they try to come out and protest against the economic situation, against governance issues, they are severely beaten down. They are arrested, they're beaten, they're harassed, they're sent to jail for many, many years. So, of course, the people are not happy with the status quo. But it's how we can remove this apparatus of security that these guys have been utilizing to keep themselves in power. And how, in fact, when you look at what you're saying, Professor, about what is keeping these guys there, we also look at the geopolitical situation and the relationship. Angola is pretty much impervious to outside influence because it's such an oil-rich nation. You look at the responsibility of the corporations that are in Angola, that work with government. Isabel Dos Santos' daughter is the richest woman in Africa. Because of that. So there's a whole list of issues that we need to be addressing in Africa on this continent. And I don't think, like the professor, we should be giving up on it. I think we should be doing more as citizens to push these leaders and to hold them accountable.
Well, let's just take a brief break there and we'll continue our discussion after the break. Do stay with us.
Let us not assume that the African people, the ordinary people, don't know what their rights are. Okay. They know what their rights are. But come elections, they are bought.
Welcome back. You're watching Africa 360. This week, we're focusing on power and leadership challenges in Africa. And I'm still joined by my eloquent guests. Let's continue with our discussion. Now, when we look at Eduardo Dos Santos, 35 years in power, Robert Mugabe, 34, Paul Biya, 32, the list is endless. These are all leaders in Africa. What can we do to address this?
Now, I think that, as I was saying during the break, let's take a step backwards. And say, why do they do that? Why would one want to stay in power until he was 90? Why would one want to control all the institutions of state? Okay. Why would one want to pervert all the institutions of state? And I mean, and we can't answer those questions until we understand the nature of the state in Africa. Okay. The state in Africa was a product of the colonial state, which was in itself was a very authoritarian state, and we inherited that. With all the bad things in it.
But 50 years on, 50 years plus after independence.
I think that was my question. Sorry, Congo, I'm taking over your questioning role, but it's 50 years down the line. Yes, these institutions were there. What we've done now is simply try to kind of change those types of institutions. There has been changes, as you say, there's new constitutions in place. Why are we still in the same place? Why are we still going back to history, in as much as it's very important?
You see, you have even changed the institutions, but you not change the characters. The characters are still there perverting the institutions.
And why are we unable to then remove these characters? I think is the question we need to ask ourselves.
No, precisely because the African states are stuck in what I always call the rent-seeking activities. And rent-seeking state unfortunately, it's not a very democratic state. But more importantly, it's not a productive state. It doesn't create classes and class forces who have an interest in the stability and democracy. Only when you have this large, huge middle class who have an interest in this state, we really have a situation where we have a force which is against this kind of thing. But we don't have that.
So is that the only solution,
yes, but for me,
Sipho?
I fully agree with the professor, because what we have is the capture of the state by a small political and economic elite. This is what the fundamental challenge of African society has been. So basically, this elite, it uses the state to further the economic interests. It uses the economic interest to consolidate state power. So there's this very unholy alliance between a small political and economic elite, which has no interest in governing.
But how can we end that? Is there a solution to that?
We need to strengthen. We need to strengthen the ability of the people.
Who is we?
To demand, well, whether it is the United Nations, it is civil society. We need the ordinary African to be able to hold to account whoever is in power, private and public sector. Now, how do we do that? The African citizen needs to be aware of what his rights are. He needs to be able to demand those rights. But the problem is that...
But Sipho, the unfortunate thing is that let us not assume that the African people, the ordinary people, don't know what their rights are. Okay. They know what their rights are. But come elections, they are bought. Because we are dealing with poor people. Come elections, they are bought.
So it's a vicious cycle, isn't it?
So it's a vicious cycle. And because earlier on you are saying that, but you are saying, but what can they do because they have been elected? They have not been elected. If you look at elections throughout Africa, there's not a
So you're saying there are no credible elections in Africa?
No,
throughout the whole continent?
Throughout the whole continent. South Africa might be an exception, but very soon it might not be.
Tiseke doesn't seem to agree with you. Tiseke?
No, I think all of us here can see the negativity in all this. I mean, obviously, it's a pretty bad situation. But then I'd like to bring in a bit of positivity that there are now countries out there that are trying to set the standards.
Which ones?
I would argue, South Africa being one of them, yes, with all its problems. I would argue if you look at Mozambique, if you look at Botswana, even though we're talking about, of course, the same parties being in place for many years now. But if you look at Tanzania, if you look at Senegal, there are countries out there that are attempting to run their countries in a manner that is rights respecting and in a manner that is democratic. The challenge is, how can we maintain that? How can we bring in these new leaders? And how can those countries that are doing the right thing, be supported internationally? And I think sometimes there's not enough international support. When you look at the kind of exploitation of our continent and the big corporations out there, there's not enough regulation, and there needs to be more.
But it's the same Africans who are calling for us to solve an African solution to African problems.
So why do we need international? Those who have interests.
Let me disagree with her. Of all the examples that you are giving us, Mozambique.
What I'm saying is changes in leadership. We start slowly. I'm saying that these things are not perfect, and I know there's problems in Mozambique.
Sipho, your thoughts on good and bad leadership in Africa? Is it just throughout the continent bad leadership?
I really don't think the picture is entirely bad. Yes. I think that there are a lot of positive changes that have happened in our continent, including the new prospects of alternation of power. I mean, in Africa, we didn't have elections as regularly. Exactly. As imperfect as elections turn out to be, we didn't have them as regularly. We never had people who lost elections and accepted to leave. So those are incremental but very important steps and changes. However, that doesn't change the fact that with these positive changes, the level of sophistication of this elite I talked about earlier has also improved. So you have elections, but you figure out a smart way of stealing them, so that the world will applaud you for having them on time, right down to the second. But you then perfect the way of stealing them. So you don't kill people, you don't beat up people, you don't buy people, but steal them in a way that nobody can. You don't leave a trace. So, but those are we move steps forward and move steps backward.
How do we address such issues?
I'm surprised that you talk about positiveness. And at the same time, You talk about this stealing, you talk about clever stealing. You can't have both, you can't have your cake and eat it. Because when you look at the rest of Africa, we went through what was called in the 80s, re-democratization of Africa, where we thought that this time round is going to be different. What has happened? As in your own words, they have learned the art of doing the same the old thing in a different way, but still the same thing. So that if you look at throughout the elections in Africa, except for South Africa, there's not a single election in Africa, whether it is Senegal, which has gone uncontested. And the evidence does seem to show that there was something really very bad in those elections.
Well, on that note, my guests, thank you very much for appearing on Africa 360. And that brings us to the end of yet another edition of Africa 360. Thank you to my guests for such a riveting debate. Please share your views on our discussion today. You can join the conversation by going to our Facebook page or tweet us your views at Africa360_ENCA. You can also send us an email to africa360@enca.com. Until next time, it's goodbye for now.